Customers inherited an implant because they did the recommended thing. They installed the SolarWinds update. The update channel was already trusted. The build was poisoned. The review of the vendor's questionnaire did not watch the build, so the signed file arrived as hygiene. SolarWinds end-to-end is the story of a trusted admin tool, a poisoned build, and a signed implant that customers pulled in because the channel was already trusted. Third-party risk management has to watch the factory that signs the file the customer is trained to install. TPRM that scores a company name and misses a pipeline will inherit whatever that factory emits. TPRM that scores a form and misses a pipeline will repeat this path. A questionnaire can pass the company while the factory is already the door. Orion is SolarWinds' enterprise network management platform. CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, describes it as a suite that monitors performance, applications, and network configuration across on-premise and hosted infrastructure. Administrators install it because they want one pane that can see routers, servers, and applications they already own. Visibility of that kind is the product. Visibility of that kind is also the privilege. To give Orion that visibility, it is common for network administrators to configure it with pervasive privileges. CISA said that in public, and that sentence is the reason Orion was a target. A tool that must read configurations, pull devices, and hold service accounts is already inside the wall that security was trained to guard. The written contract treats that access as operations. An attacker treats that access as a completed first step. The product was not a side door that someone forgot. The product was a trusted admin tool that the business asked to see everything. Customers keep a tool like that current. A recommended update is hygiene. The installer is signed. The console tells the operator that a hotfix is waiting. The security team wants the vendor's fixes applied. That is the update channel, and it is already trusted before anyone writes a questionnaire. Trust here is not a feeling. Trust is the decision to run the vendor's binary with the same rights the last binary had. If that binary changes in the vendor's factory, the customer inherits the change. A software build is the factory step that turns source into a binary the customer can install. Source is what developers write. The build compiles that source, links it, and hands the result to a signer. CI/CD is the automated path that repeats that factory step. If an attacker can change what the compiler sees, the signer will still sign, because the signer is proving the vendor's key touched the file, not that the file matches the source the developers remember. The path is the build. The questionnaire usually stops at the company name on the invoice. Public Technical Analysis later described a build time implant named SUNSPOT that sat on the SolarWinds build environment. It watched for the compilation of Orion. When that compile started, it swapped in a source file that carried the backdoor, let the compiler finish, and then put the original source back. The source repository could stay clean. Developers who read the tree would not see the implant. The compiled DLL would still contain it. Microsoft's Public Analysis said the actors had tested insertion earlier by adding empty classes, so the path was proven before the implant shipped. That is why watching the repo is not watching the build. The malicious binary was a library named SolarWinds Orion Core Business Layer DLL. CISA's public alert says the adversary placed that binary into the SolarWinds software lifecycle, and that it was then signed by the legitimate SolarWinds code signing certificate. Microsoft's Public Analysis said the insertion happened before the final signing step, so the implant left the factory looking like every other signed Orion file. A signed implant is still an implant. The signature answers who held the vendor key. It does not answer whether the build was honest. Customers pulled it in because the channel told them to. Affected Orion platform builds in 2019 and 2020 shipped as ordinary platform versions and hotfixes. Operators who followed vendor guidance installed them. The file arrived through the path the written contract already treated as safe. No one had to click a lure. No one had to misconfigure a bucket. The recommended thing was the delivery. That is the difference between a fish and a supply chain update. The second one is what a careful team is paid to do. Microsoft's Public Analysis said the actors had tested insertion earlier by adding empty classes. They proved the swap before the implant shipped. A review that only read the questionnaire would have scored the company while that rehearsal was already running on the build host. Watching the repo would still have missed it because the empty class never had to stay in the tree. One vendor became many estates because those estates already shared the same trusted channel. Orion sat in governments, critical infrastructure, and private companies. Seesaw described impact across those classes, and later said activity had begun at least as early as March 2020, with public disclosure in December. In that same December, Seesaw issued Emergency Directive 2101, ordering federal civilian agencies to disconnect affected Orion devices. Each customer that installed the affected build received a signed copy of the same library. The attacker did not have to break each wall. The attacker broke the factory that those walls already trusted. Concentration here is not a logo preference. Concentration is a single signed file that can enter every estate that did the hygiene the vendor asked for. Once installed, Sunburst called out to a domain, using a protocol designed to mimic legitimate SolarWinds traffic. Seesaw named that first check-in path, and said the adversary could then use DNS answers to select which victims would receive further command and control. Not every organization that received the backdoor was chosen for follow-on action. That public fact matters, because a count of who downloaded an update is not a count of who was entered next. The implant was widely inherited. The next stage was selective. TPRM still owns the inheritance, because the signed file was already inside. Follow on, where it happened, used the position Orion already had. A monitoring platform with pervasive privileges can become a place to steal more credentials, to move, and to mint tokens that other systems will accept. Public reporting described that class of post-implant work. The end-to-end path does not require a tour of every later technique. The first hop was not a break-in at the customer. The first hop was a recommended update from a vendor the customer had already reviewed. The path is complete only when we can say what the review failed to watch. A vendor questionnaire can ask whether the company encrypts laptops, whether it has an incident plan, and whether an auditor signed a report. Those questions can all receive a yes, while a build server accepts a swap the developers will never see. The form reviews the company. The implant was manufactured in the pipeline. Point-in-time evidence photographs a Tuesday. A build that compiles overnight is not a Tuesday photograph. A complete folder still delivered Sunburst because the folder never sat on the compile host. Watching the build means treating the vendor's CI/CD path as part of the attack surface you already inherited. The review has to ask who can write to the pipeline. It has to ask whether the build host is isolated from ordinary developer laptops. It has to ask whether signing is a separate control with a separate key or a stamp that fires on whatever the compiler emitted. It has to ask whether the vendor can prove a binary matches a source revision, which is provenance, not a slogan. It has to ask whether a software bill of materials exists, so a changed library has a name. Those are evidence questions. They are not comfort questions. For TPRM, watching the build also means staging what the customer will accept. A signed update can still be held, canaried, and hashed against a known good list before it touches the privileged tool. The customer cannot rebuild Orion. The customer can refuse to treat every hotfix as an emergency that skips a ring. The written contract should require notice of build system incidents, the right to delay a channel, and artifacts that show how source becomes a signed file. Goodwill from a long relationship is welcome. Goodwill is not a provenance check. This pattern is why the United States issued Executive Order 14028, and why NIST published 800-218, the Secure Software Development Framework. Those documents exist because a trusted installer can carry a payload. They do not make the questionnaire obsolete. They move the duty onto the build, the signer, and the update channel that customers were already trained to obey. TPRM that ignores that duty is still reviewing a company name while the factory is the path. Orion was a trusted admin tool with pervasive privileges. Sunburst was a signed implant that left the factory looking like every other Orion file. One vendor became many estates because those estates already shared the same channel. The review failed to watch the build. Watching the build is now the work of TPRM. Thank you.